The barn key trembled in my hand as I stood before the massive wooden doors, knowing that whatever lay inside would change everything. The rusty lock clicked open after 18 years of waiting, and as the doors creaked apart, sunlight streamed across something that made my breath catch in my throat. There, covered in a dusty tarp, sat a vintage truck with a handwritten note tucked under the windshield wiper that simply read, "For my granddaughter, when she's ready to come home." But let me start from the beginning, because the journey to that moment began 3 months earlier when I was sitting in the cramped office of Riverside Children's Home, staring at a manila envelope that had arrived with my name on it. At 18, I was aging out of the system, just like dozens of kids before me. The social worker, Janet Stewart, had seen it all before, but even she seemed surprised by the contents of that envelope. "Heather Allen," she said, reading from the letter with raised eyebrows. "It says here that your grandmother, Rachel Stewart, has left you property in Millbrook County. Apparently, she passed away 6 months ago, but her attorney has been trying to locate you through the state system." Janet looked up at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Did you know you had a grandmother?" I shook my head, my throat suddenly dry. The only family story I'd ever been told was that my mother had died when I was born, and my father was unknown. No grandparents, no aunts or uncles. No one who wanted a crying baby with nowhere else to go. For 18 years, I believed I was completely alone in the world. "There's more," Janet continued, pulling out a small, tarnished key attached to a leather cord. "She left specific instructions that you should receive this barn key along with the deed to her property. The letter says, and I quote, 'What's inside will help her understand where she comes from.' Before we see how this ends, tell us where you're watching from and hype this video in the comments. I have a feeling you're going to want to share this story with someone who needs to hear it." That night, I lay in my narrow bed in the group home, turning the key over and over in my hands. The metal was worn smooth in places, as if someone had handled it frequently over many years. I tried to imagine this grandmother I'd never known, tried to picture what kind of life she'd lived and why she'd never reached out to me. Had she even known I existed? The next morning, I was on a Greyhound bus heading to Millbrook County with everything I owned stuffed into a single duffel bag. The social worker had arranged for me to meet with Rachel Stewart's attorney, Paul Wright, who would handle the property transfer. As the bus rolled through increasingly rural landscapes, I pressed my face to the window and watched farmland stretch endlessly in every direction. Millbrook turned out to be one of those small towns where everyone knows everyone, where the main street consists of a diner, a feed store, a post office, and not much else. Paul Wright's office was above the hardware store, reached by a narrow staircase that creaked with every step. He was a kind man in his 60s with gentle eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. "Your grandmother was a remarkable woman," he told me as he spread the property documents across his desk. "She owned 40 acres about 5 miles outside town, including a farmhouse that's been in your family for 3 generations. She lived alone out there for the past 15 years, ever since your grandfather died. Why didn't she ever contact me?" The question had been burning in my chest since I'd received the letter. Paul's expression grew sad. "She tried, Heather. She tried for years, but your mother, Laura, had cut all contact with the family before you were born. There was some kind of falling out, and Laura made it clear she wanted nothing to do with her parents. When Laura died and you went into the system, Rachel hired private investigators to find you, but the state wouldn't release information about your placement." He handed me a thick folder. "She never stopped looking. These are copies of all the letters she wrote to various agencies, all the dead ends she hit trying to locate you. She made me promise that when she died, I would find you no matter what it took." My hands shook as I flipped through page after page of correspondence, letter after letter to social service, to courts, to anyone who might help her find her granddaughter. Each rejection letter was paperclipped to her original inquiry, creating a heartbreaking timeline of hope and disappointment. "She left you something else," Paul said, reaching into his desk drawer. He pulled out a sealed envelope with my name written in careful cursive. "She updated this letter every year on your birthday, hoping that someday she'd get to give it to you in person." I couldn't open it there in his office. Instead, I tucked it carefully into my jacket pocket and asked him to drive me out to the property. The farmhouse sat at the end of a long gravel driveway, surrounded by fields that stretched to the horizon. It was larger than I'd expected, a two-story white house with a wraparound porch and green shutters. Behind it stood a massive red barn that looked like something from a postcard. She kept the house in good condition, Paul explained as we walked up to the front porch. She always said she was keeping it ready for when you came home. The key to the front door was hidden under a flower pot, just as Paul had said it would be. Inside, the house felt frozen in time, but not in a sad way. It felt like someone had just stepped out for a moment and would be back soon. Family photos lined the mantelpiece, and I found myself staring at pictures of a woman who had my eyes and my stubborn chin. In the kitchen, I found a calendar on the wall with my birthday circled in red every year, going back as far as I could see. Next to each date, someone had written Heather's 10th birthday or Heather's 15th birthday in that same careful handwriting I'd seen on the envelope. That's when I finally opened her letter, sitting at the kitchen table where she'd probably eaten thousands of meals while thinking about the granddaughter she'd never met. "My dearest Heather," it began, "if you're reading this, then I'm gone, but you're finally home. I have so much I want to tell you about your mother, about our family, about why things happened the way they did. But first, I want you to know that not a single day has passed that I haven't thought about you and prayed that you were safe and loved." The letter went on for pages, telling me about my mother's childhood, about how Laura had been a spirited, independent girl who'd clashed with her parents over their traditional expectations, how she'd left home at 17 after a terrible fight about her choice to move to the city instead of staying to help run the farm, how my grandparents had been too proud to chase after her, thinking she'd come home when she was ready. "We were wrong," the letter continued. "We should have swallowed our pride and gone after her. We should have told her that we loved her more than our expectations. By the time we realized our mistake, it was too late. She was gone, and then you were born, and then she was gone forever." But it was the last paragraph that made me cry harder than I had since I was a small child. "I hope you can forgive an old woman for the years we lost. I hope you'll stay and let this place be your home, the way it should have been all along. Everything here is yours now, including all the love I never got to give you. Check the barn, sweetheart. I left something special for you there." That's how I found myself standing in front of those barn doors, the key my grandmother had left me, my heart pounding as I turned the lock and pushed them open. The truck was beautiful, a 1965 Ford pickup in pristine condition, painted the same red as the barn itself. But it wasn't just the truck that took my breath away. The entire barn had been converted into a workshop, and every inch of wall space was covered with things that told the story of my family. There were photo albums dating back decades, showing my mother as a baby, as a toddler learning to walk, as a young girl helping in the garden. There were school reports and art projects, carefully preserved in plastic sleeves. There were newspaper clippings about local events with my grandparents' names highlighted whenever they were mentioned. And there were letters, boxes and boxes of letters that my grandmother had written to me over the years but never sent. Birthday cards for every year I'd been alive. Christmas presents, still wrapped, with tags that read, "For Heather, with love from Grandma." I spent hours in that barn, piecing together the story of a family that had been waiting for me to come home. My grandmother had been the president of the local historical society, a volunteer at the church, and apparently famous for her apple pies at the county fair. My grandfather had been a mechanic who'd restored classic cars in his spare time, which explained the immaculate condition of the truck. But it was a small wooden box tucked under the truck's seat that contained the most precious treasure of all. Inside were my mother's journals from when she was my age, filled with dreams and fears, and the kind of teenage angst that felt familiar even across the decades. Reading her words, I began to understand that the fight that had driven her away hadn't been about hatred or lack of love. It had been about two generations who loved each other but couldn't find a way to bridge the gap between tradition and independence. "I love them," she'd written in one entry, "but they want me to be someone I'm not. They want me to stay here and marry Jeremy Nguyen from down the road and have babies and be content with a small life. But I want more than that. I want to see the world, to go to college, to make something of myself. Why can't they understand that wanting more doesn't mean I love them less?" I understood both sides now. My grandparents, who'd built a life on this land and wanted to share it with their daughter, and my mother, who'd felt suffocated by expectations and had chosen freedom over family, not knowing that she was carrying me and that her choices would ripple through generations. That first night, I slept in my mother's childhood bedroom, surrounded by the stuffed animals and books she'd left behind. I dreamed about the life I might have had if things had been different, if pride and misunderstanding hadn't kept us apart for so many years. The next morning, I was awakened by a knock at the front door. A man in his 30s stood on the porch, holding a casserole dish and wearing a concerned expression. "You must be Heather," he said. "I'm Jeremy Nguyen. My family owns the farm next door. We were friends with your grandparents for years." He paused, studying my face. "You look just like your mother." Jeremy, it turned out, was the same Jeremy my mother had mentioned in her journal. Though he'd long since married someone else and had 3 kids of his own, he'd been keeping an eye on my grandmother's property since she'd passed away, making sure the house stayed secure and the basic systems kept running. "She talked about you all the time," he told me as we sat on the front porch, sharing coffee and the coffee cake his wife had sent over. "Every time she came to town, she'd have some new theory about where you might be, what you might be doing. She was so proud of you, even though she'd never met you." "Proud of what?" I asked, genuinely confused. "I didn't do anything worth being proud of." Jeremy smiled. "She said any girl who could survive 18 years in the system and still have hope had to be strong and brave and special. She used to say that when you finally came home, you'd be exactly the person this place needed." Over the next few weeks, I began to understand what he meant. The farm had been neglected since my grandfather's death, and my grandmother, in her 70s, hadn't been able to keep up with the physical demands of maintaining 40 acres. The fields were overgrown, the fences needed repair, and the outbuildings required attention that I had no idea how to provide. But the community that had loved my grandparents seemed determined to help me learn. Gregory Roberts, who ran the feed store, taught me about crop rotation and soil management. Peter Williams, a retired mechanic who'd worked with my grandfather, showed me how to maintain the vintage truck and the other equipment stored in the barn. Alan Powell, who owned the neighboring dairy farm, helped me understand the business side of farming and connected me with programs for young farmers. It wasn't easy. There were days when I felt completely overwhelmed, when the gap between what I knew and what I needed to know seemed impossibly wide. I'd grown up in cities and suburbs, moving from one foster placement to another. I knew how to navigate public transportation and apply for grounding and stretch a food budget, but I'd never planted anything in my life. But slowly, something magical began to happen. As I worked the land my family had tended for generations, I felt a connection I'd never experienced before. When I planted my first garden using seeds my grandmother had saved from the previous year, when I repaired fence posts using tools my grandfather had left behind, when I learned to drive the vintage truck on the same roads my mother had traveled as a child, I felt like I was finally becoming who I was meant to be. The house began to feel like home in ways I'd never imagined possible. I cooked meals in the kitchen where my grandmother had prepared thousands of family dinners. I read books from the extensive library my grandfather had collected over decades. I slept in rooms where generations of my family had dreamed and planned and loved. And gradually I began to understand the gift my grandmother had really left me. It wasn't just the land or the house or even the truck, though those things were precious beyond measure. It was the knowledge that I belonged somewhere, that I was part of something larger than myself, that I had roots that ran deep into this soil. 6 months after I'd arrived in Millbrook, I was working in the garden when a car pulled up the driveway. A woman in her 40s got out, looking nervous and uncertain. She had my grandmother's eyes and my mother's stubborn chin, and I knew immediately who she was before she even introduced herself. "I'm Deborah Campbell," she said hesitantly. "Rachel Stewart was my aunt. I heard that Laura's daughter had finally come home." Deborah, it turned out, was my mother's cousin, someone who tried to mediate between my mother and grandparents all those years ago. She'd moved away after college and had lost touch with the family, but news of my arrival had reached her through the small-town network that seemed to connect everyone in rural communities. "I have some things that belong to your mother," she told me, pulling a small suitcase from her car. "Things she left with me before she moved to the city. I always hoped I'd get the chance to give them to her daughter someday." Inside the suitcase were treasures I'd never dreamed existed. My mother's high school graduation photos, letters from friends, a journal from her senior year filled with college plans and dreams of the future. There was also a letter addressed to me, written when my mother was pregnant and scared and trying to figure out how to build a life for us both. "My sweet baby," the letter began, "I don't know what kind of world I'm bringing you into, but I promise I'll do everything I can to give you opportunities I never had. I want you to be brave enough to chase your dreams, but smart enough to know that family matters more than pride. I hope someday you'll understand why I had to leave, and I hope you'll be wise enough not to make the same mistakes I did." Reading those words, sitting in the house where my mother had grown up, I finally understood the full circle of my story. My mother had left to give me opportunities, but in doing so, she'd cut me off from the very roots that might have given me the stability I'd spent my childhood craving. She'd chosen independence over family, not knowing that it was possible to have both. But now I had the chance to honor both parts of my heritage. I could pursue my dreams while staying connected to the land and community that had shaped my family for generations. I could be independent while still belonging somewhere. The first year was hard, learning to farm while finishing my high school diploma through online classes, managing the finances of a property I'd inherited, navigating the social dynamics of a small town where everyone knew my family's history better than I did. There were nights when I lay awake wondering if I was crazy to think I could make this work, if maybe I should sell the property and use the money to go to college somewhere far away. But every time I doubted myself, I'd find another piece of my family's story. A recipe in my grandmother's handwriting tucked inside a cookbook. A photo of my grandfather teaching my mother to drive the same truck I now drove to town. A letter from my grandmother to a friend, describing her hopes for the granddaughter she'd never met but loved anyway. And slowly the community that had welcomed me began to feel like the family I'd never had. When I got sick with the flu my first winter, neighbors showed up with soup and medicine and offers to help with the animals I'd started raising. When a storm damaged my roof, half the town showed up on Saturday morning with tools and materials to fix it. When I needed advice about crop insurance or equipment loans or a dozen other things I'd never had to think about before, there was always someone willing to teach me. Jeremy Nguyen became like the big brother I'd never had, patient and kind, as he taught me everything from how to change the oil in my truck to how to read the weather signs that farmers had relied on for generations. His wife Rachel became my closest friend, someone who understood what it was like to marry into this community and have to learn its rhythms and traditions. Gregory Roberts at the feed store became my unofficial business advisor, helping me understand markets and seasons and the 100 small decisions that could make the difference between profit and loss. Peter Williams taught me not just how to fix things, but how to see problems before they became emergencies, how to maintain and care for the tools and equipment that made my life possible. And Alan Powell, the dairy farmer next door, became something like the grandfather I'd never known, full of stories about the old days and wisdom about how to build a life that would last. He'd known my grandparents since they were all young, and through his memories, I began to understand the people who'd loved me from a distance for so many years. By my second spring on the farm, I'd found my rhythm. I was growing vegetables for the local farmers market, raising chickens for eggs, and had even started a small business, making preserves from the fruit trees my grandmother had planted decades earlier. The vintage truck had become my trademark around town, and people would wave when they saw me driving to market with the bed full of produce. But it was the discovery I made while cleaning out the attic that truly completed my understanding of my family's legacy. Hidden behind a stack of old Christmas decorations, I found a wooden chest filled with documents that told the story of how my great-grandparents had bought this land during the Depression, how they'd built the house and barn with their own hands, how they'd survived droughts and floods and economic hardships that would have broken weaker people. There were letters from my great-grandmother to her sister back east, describing the challenges and joys of frontier life. There were my great-grandfather's journals, detailing his experiments with different crops and his observations about weather patterns and soil conditions. There were photographs of barn raisings and harvest celebrations, of neighbors helping neighbors through good times and bad. And there were documents that showed how the farm had evolved over the generations, how my great-grandparents had started with just 20 acres and gradually expanded, how my grandparents had modernized the operation while keeping the traditional values that had sustained the family through hard times, How my grandmother had maintained everything after my grandfather's death, keeping it ready for the granddaughter she believed would someday come home. Looking through those papers, I realized that I wasn't just inheriting property. I was inheriting a legacy of resilience, of community, of people who'd understood that success wasn't measured just in dollars, but in the strength of the relationships you built and the land you left better than you found it. That summer, I decided to host the first family reunion the farm had seen in decades. Using the contact information Deborah had given me, I reached out to cousins and distant relatives scattered across the country, many of whom had lost touch with each other after my grandparents' deaths. They came from California and Texas, from Chicago and Atlanta, bringing their children and their stories and their own pieces of our family's puzzle. We filled the house and pitched tents in the yard, and for one magical weekend, the farm was alive with the kind of energy it had been designed for. My cousin Michael, who worked in tech in Silicon Valley, was amazed by the vintage truck and the restored barn. My cousin Sarah, a teacher in Denver, spent hours going through the photo albums and family documents I'd discovered. Her daughter Emma, who was about the age my mother had been when she'd left home, was fascinated by the journals and letters that showed what life had been like for young women in previous generations. "It's like a time capsule," Emma said as we sat on the front porch one evening, watching fireflies dance over the fields. "Like your grandmother kept everything exactly the way it was, waiting for someone to come back and continue the story." That's exactly what it felt like. Not an ending, but a new beginning. Not a return to the past, but a foundation for building something new while honoring what had come before. As the reunion weekend wound down and relatives began the long drives back to their scattered lives, many of them asked if I'd consider making this an annual tradition. They wanted their children to know this place, to understand where they'd come from, to have roots in something deeper than the suburban neighborhoods where most of them were growing up. I realized then that my grandmother's gift hadn't just been about giving me a home. It had been about preserving a gathering place for a family that had been scattered by time and distance and misunderstanding. By staying, by learning to work this land, by becoming part of this community, I was keeping alive something that was bigger than just my own story. That fall, I enrolled in agricultural extension classes at the community college, determined to learn not just how to maintain what my grandparents had built, but how to improve it. I wanted to understand sustainable farming practices, modern marketing techniques, and business management skills that would help me build something that could support not just me, but potentially other young people who might need a place to belong. I started thinking about the other kids aging out of foster care, the ones who were facing the same uncertainty and loneliness I'd experienced. What if the farm could become a place where young adults could learn job skills while figuring out their next steps? What if the community that had embraced me could extend that same welcome to others who needed it? The idea grew slowly through conversations with social workers and agricultural educators, through research into programs that combine farming with youth development. By the end of my second year on the farm, I had a business plan for what I was calling the Stewart Family Farm Youth Program, designed to provide temporary housing, job training, and mentorship for young adults transitioning out of foster care. Paul Wright, who'd become something like a surrogate grandfather to me, helped me navigate the legal requirements for establishing a nonprofit organization. Jeremy and his wife Rachel offered to help with programming and supervision. Alan Powell volunteered to teach agricultural skills, while Gregory Roberts agreed to provide business mentoring. But it was Peter Williams who offered the most meaningful support. "Your grandfather would be proud," he told me one afternoon as we worked on restoring a second vintage truck he'd found in a neighbor's barn. He always said this place was meant to be more than just a farm. He said it was meant to be a place where people could learn what it meant to belong somewhere. The first young person to join the program was a 19-year-old named Marcus, who'd aged out of care in the city and was struggling to find work and housing. He arrived suspicious and guarded, much the way I'd felt when I'd first come to Millbrook. But gradually, as he learned to care for the animals and work in the gardens, as he experienced the satisfaction of building something with his own hands, I watched him begin to relax and open up. "I never thought I was a country person," he told me one evening as we sat on the porch after a long day of fence repair. "But there's something about this place. It's like, for the first time in my life, I feel like I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." That's when I knew my grandmother's vision was working. The farm wasn't just preserving the past, it was creating a future for young people who needed what I'd needed. A place to belong, a chance to learn, and a community willing to invest in their potential. By the end of my third year, the program was hosting 6 young adults at a time, each staying for 6 to 12 months while they completed their education, learned job skills, and figured out their next steps. Some went on to college, others found careers in agriculture or skilled trades, and a few even decided to stay in Millbrook and become part of the community that had welcomed them. The farm itself was thriving too. The combination of traditional crops and value-added products like preserves and baked goods had created a sustainable income stream. The farmers market had become a regular gathering place where I could connect with customers and share the story of the farm in the program. Local to. Restaurants were buying our produce, and we'd even started hosting farm-to-table dinners that brought city visitors out to experience rural life. But the real measure of success wasn't financial. It was the sense of purpose I felt every morning when I woke up in the house where my mother had been born, where my grandparents had loved and worked and dreamed. It was the knowledge that the legacy they'd built was continuing, evolving, growing into something that honored the past while meeting the needs of the present. It was also the letters I received from young people who'd been part of the program, telling me about the jobs they'd found, the families they'd built, the ways that their time on the farm had changed their understanding of what was possible for their lives. They wrote about confidence they'd gained, skills they'd learned, and most importantly, the sense of belonging they'd discovered in a community that had welcomed them as family. On the 5th anniversary of my arrival in Millbrook, the town organized a celebration that brought together everyone who'd been part of the farm's story. Former program participants came back with their partners and children. Relatives from across the country returned for another reunion. Neighbors and community members who'd supported the program from the beginning gathered to share food and stories and gratitude. Standing in the barn where I'd first discovered my family's history, surrounded by the people who'd become my chosen family, I thought about the key my grandmother had left me and everything it had unlocked. It hadn't just opened a barn door, it had opened a life I'd never imagined possible. The vintage truck, now joined by 2 others that program participants had helped restore, sat gleaming in the afternoon sun. The walls were still covered with family photos and documents, but now they were joined by pictures of all the young people who'd found their way to this place, who'd become part of its continuing story. I thought about my mother who'd left this place seeking opportunities and independence, never knowing that her daughter would one day return to find both. I thought about my grandparents, who'd maintained their faith that family would eventually find its way home. And I thought about all the young people who'd come after me, who discovered that belonging wasn't something you were born with, but something you could create through love and work and commitment to something larger than yourself. That evening, as the celebration wound down and the last visitors drove away, I sat on the front porch with the barn key in my hand, just as I had on that first overwhelming day 5 years earlier. But everything was different now. The key no longer represented mystery and uncertainty. It represented possibility and purpose, and the kind of deep satisfaction that comes from knowing you're exactly where you belong. I thought about the letter I'd written to the county social services office, offering to mentor other young adults aging out of care. I thought about the college scholarship fund we'd established for program participants, funded by the profits from the farm and donations from community members who believed in second chances. I thought about the expansion plans we were developing, the possibility of creating similar programs on other family farms throughout the region. But mostly I thought about the miracle of connection, the way that love can bridge decades and misunderstandings, the way that a community can become family for those who need it most. My grandmother had left me more than property. She'd left me a blueprint for building a life that mattered, a legacy that could grow and change while staying rooted in the values that had sustained our family through generations of challenges. As I got ready for bed that night, I walked through the house that had become home, touching the photographs and mementos that told our family's story. In my mother's old room, now used by program participants, I found a journal that one of the young women had left behind after completing the program. She'd written about her first day on the farm, about how scared and uncertain she'd felt, about how the community had gradually welcomed her and helped her believe in her own potential. "I never thought I was the kind of person who belonged anywhere," she had written. "But this place taught me that belonging isn't about being perfect or having the right background. It's about being willing to work hard, to care about something bigger than yourself, and to trust that people can see your potential even when you can't see it yourself." Reading those words, I realized that this was my grandmother's real gift. Not just the farm or the house or the vintage truck, but the understanding that home isn't a place you're born into. It's a place you choose to build day by day through the relationships you nurture and the legacy you create. Now, 7 years after I first turned that barn key, I wake up every morning in a house filled with purpose. The farm supports not just me, but a rotating group of young adults who are learning that they have value, that they have potential, that they belong somewhere. The community that welcomed me has grown to embrace dozens of young people who might otherwise have faced the world alone. We've preserved the traditions that made this place special while adapting them for a new generation. We still grow the heirloom varieties my grandmother favored, but we've added crops that meet modern market demands. We still gather for community meals and celebrations, but now those gatherings include people from backgrounds my grandparents never could have imagined. The vintage truck still runs perfectly, maintained with the same care my grandfather showed when he restored it decades ago. But now it shares the barn with a modern delivery van that takes our products to farmers markets in 3 counties. And with the equipment we use to teach young people job skills that will serve them wherever their lives take them. I keep my grandmother's letter in the kitchen drawer, and I reread it whenever I need to remember why this work matters. Her words about love and forgiveness and the importance of home guide every decision I make about the farm's future. Her faith that I would eventually find my way here sustains me through the challenges of running a program that changes young lives. But perhaps the most meaningful part of my grandmother's legacy is the way it's taught me to think about family. I've learned that family isn't just about blood relationships. It's about the people who choose to invest in your future, who believe in your potential, who welcome you home even when you've never been there before. The young people who come through our program become part of an extended family that now spans the country. They stay in touch with each other, offering support and encouragement as they build their own lives. They return for reunions and celebrations, bringing their own children to experience the place that helps shape their understanding of what's possible. Some of them have gone on to establish similar programs in their own communities, spreading the model of agricultural education combined with youth development. Others have become teachers, social workers, entrepreneurs, and community leaders who carry forward the values they learned here. A few have even returned to Millbrook permanently, becoming part of the community that nurtured them. Last month, I received a letter from Marcus, the first young man who joined our program. He's now married with 2 children, working as a supervisor at a sustainable agriculture operation in Oregon. He wrote to tell me that he and his wife are buying a small farm where they plan to host urban kids for summer programs, teaching them about food production and environmental stewardship. "I want to pass on what you taught me," he wrote, "that everyone deserves a place where they belong, and that the best way to heal from a difficult past is to help create a better future for someone else." That letter sits on my desk now, next to the barn key that started this whole journey. Sometimes I pick up both items and think about the chain of generosity that connects them. My grandmother's faith in a granddaughter she'd never met, the community's willingness to welcome a stranger, the young people who've trusted us with their futures, the donors and volunteers who have made our work possible. Each link in that chain represents someone who chose hope over cynicism, who believed that investing in others is the best way to honor the gifts we've received ourselves. It's a lesson I try to live every day, whether I'm teaching a new program participant how to drive the vintage truck or meeting with potential donors who might help us expand our services. The farm has taught me that healing happens in community, that growth requires both roots and room to spread, that the most Westican, meaningful legacy you can leave is the knowledge that you've helped others discover their own potential. These aren't just agricultural principles. They're life principles that apply whether you're growing crops or growing young lives. As I write this, sitting in the kitchen where my grandmother wrote countless letters to agencies that couldn't help her find me, I'm planning our biggest expansion yet. We've received a grant to purchase an adjacent property where we can house more program participants and offer additional training in sustainable agriculture, renewable energy, and rural entrepreneurship. The new facility will include dormitory-style housing, expanded workshop space, and classroom areas where we can host educational programs for schools and youth organizations. We're partnering with the state university to offer college credit for some of our courses, giving participants a head start on their post-secondary education. But we're also planning something that would have made my grandmother especially proud. A family history center where we'll help program participants research their own backgrounds and connect with relatives they may have lost touch with. Too many young people in foster care grow up believing they have no family history, no legacy to claim. We want to help them discover that everyone comes from somewhere, that everyone's story matters, that understanding your past can help you build a better future. The center will be housed in a restored version of the original farmhouse where my great-grandparents lived when they first settled this land. We'll use it to teach the young people about genealogy research, family storytelling, and the importance of preserving personal history. We'll help them create their own family trees, including the chosen family they build through relationships and community. I think my grandmother would love knowing that her faith and family legacy is helping other young people discover their own connections and create new traditions that honor both their past and their potential. She understood something that took me years to fully grasp, that belonging isn't just about finding your place in an existing family, but about creating family for others who need it. Every morning when I walk out to the barn, I pass the spot where I first stood with that key in my hand, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what I'd inherited. Now I understand that the inheritance wasn't really about the property or the money or even the family history, though all of those things were precious gifts. The real inheritance was the responsibility to continue a legacy of welcome, of opportunity, of believing that everyone deserves a chance to discover who they're meant to become. The young people in our current cohort come from backgrounds as varied as you can imagine. There's Sarah, who aged out of care after spending her childhood in 7 different foster homes, now learning sustainable farming techniques she plans to use in urban agriculture projects. There's David, who was homeless for 2 years before finding our program, now studying for his GED, while managing our chicken operation with a skill that amazes our agricultural mentors. There's Maria, whose parents were deported when she was 16, leaving her to navigate the system alone, now developing a business plan for a catering company that will serve farm-to-table meals at events throughout the region. And there's James, who survived an abusive foster placement and came to us angry and suspicious, now gentle and patient as he works with our therapy horses and helps newer participants adjust to farm life. Each of them carries wounds from their past, but they're also discovering strengths they never knew they had. They're learning that their difficult experiences haven't disqualified them from success. They've prepared them to help others who face similar challenges. They're discovering that resilience isn't just about surviving hard times. It's about using what you've learned to make life better for the people who come after you. Watching them grow and change, seeing them support each other through setbacks and celebrate each other's victories, I'm reminded daily of why this work matters. These aren't just individual success stories. They're proof that with the right support and opportunities, young people who've been written off by society can become leaders and innovators and community builders. The program has also changed me in ways I never expected. When I first arrived in Millbrook, I was focused on my own healing, my own need to understand where I came from and where I belonged. But working with young people who've faced challenges that make my own experiences seem manageable has taught me that healing happens best when it's shared, that purpose comes from serving something larger than your own needs. I've learned to see strength in vulnerability, to recognize that the young people who've survived the most difficult circumstances often have the most to offer others facing similar struggles. I've learned that mentorship isn't about having all the answers. It's about being willing to walk alongside someone as they find their own path forward. Most importantly, I've learned that family is something you create as much as something you inherit. The relationships I've built with program participants, community members, and the extended network of people who support our work have become as meaningful to me as the blood relationships I discovered through my grandmother's legacy. This understanding has shaped how we structure the program itself. Rather than treating participants as clients or students, we treat them as family members who are learning to take their place in a community that values their contributions. They're not just receiving services, they're participating in something larger than themselves, something that will continue long after they've moved on to their own, independent lives. We've seen the power of this approach in the way alumni of the program stay connected, not just to us, but to each other. They form support networks that last for years, helping each other through career transitions, relationship challenges, and the ongoing process of building stable, meaningful lives. They return to mentor newer participants, sharing their own stories of transformation and offering proof that change is possible. Last week, we hosted our annual alumni reunion, and I was amazed by the diversity of paths our former participants have taken. Teachers and social workers, yes, but also entrepreneurs and artists, mechanics and nurses, graduate students, and skilled tradespeople. Some have stayed in rural communities like Millbrook, while others have returned to cities where they're applying what they learned here to urban agriculture projects, youth development programs, and social enterprises. What they all share is a sense of confidence and purpose that wasn't there when they first arrived. They know they belong somewhere, they know they have skills and value to offer, and they know they're part of a community that will support them through whatever challenges they face. Standing in the barn during that reunion, surrounded by young adults who'd found their way forward after difficult starts, I thought about the letter my grandmother had written about wanting me to understand where I came from. I finally do understand, but it's deeper than just knowing my family history or inheriting property. I understand that I come from a tradition of people who believed in second chances, who knew that everyone deserves a place to belong, who understood that the best way to honor the gifts you've received is to share them with others who need them. I come from people who weren't perfect, who made mistakes and had regrets, but who never stopped believing that love could bridge any gap, that family could be built as well as born, that home was something you created through daily choices to invest in each other's futures. That understanding has become the foundation for everything we do here. When new participants arrive, often scared and suspicious and convinced that they don't deserve good things, we tell them about the legacy they're joining. We tell them about my grandmother, who never stopped believing that her granddaughter would come home. We tell them about the community that welcomed me before I'd proven myself worthy of welcome. We tell them about all the young people who've walked this path before them and found their way to meaningful lives. But mostly we show them through our actions that they belong here, that their potential matters, that someone believes in their ability to overcome their past and build the future they want. We show them that family isn't about being perfect. It's about being committed to each other's growth and healing. As I prepare for bed tonight, I'll do what I've done every night for the past 7 years. I'll walk through the house, checking on the young people who are currently calling this place home, making sure everyone has what they need for tomorrow's work. I'll stop by the kitchen where my grandmother's calendar still hangs, now filled with the birthdays and milestones of dozens of young people who've become part of our extended family. And I'll end my day in the barn, touching the key that unlocked not just a door, but an entire life I never could have imagined. I'll think about my grandmother's faith, my mother's courage, and the community's generosity that made all of this possible. I'll think about the young people sleeping upstairs, dreaming their own dreams of what they might become. Tomorrow will bring new challenges, new opportunities to learn and grow and serve. There will be crops to tend and animals to care for, educational programs to run, and business decisions to make. There will be moments of frustration when progress seems slow, and moments of joy when breakthrough happens and a young person discovers something they didn't know they were capable of achieving. But tonight, I'm simply grateful. Grateful for the grandmother who never gave up hope. Grateful for the community that taught me what belonging really means. Grateful for the young people who've trusted us with their futures and shown me that healing and hope are always possible, no matter how difficult the starting point. The barn key sits on my nightstand now, no longer a mystery, but a reminder of everything that's possible when people choose to invest in each other's potential. It reminds me that the most precious inheritances aren't material things, but the values and relationships and opportunities we pass on to the next generation. 7 years ago, I was an 18-year-old aging out of foster care with no family, no home, and no clear path forward. Today, I'm part of a community that spans generations and geography, connected by shared values of resilience, generosity, and hope. I'm the steward of a legacy that's growing and changing while staying true to its roots. But the most meaningful part of this journey has been discovering that I'm not just the recipient of my grandmother's gift. I'm part of its continuation. Every young person who finds their way here, every life that's changed, every person who discovers they belong somewhere is part of the legacy my grandmother started when she refused to give up hope that her granddaughter would someday come home. If you're watching this story and you're someone who's struggling to find where you belong, I want you to know that your story isn't over. There are communities waiting to welcome you, people ready to invest in your potential, opportunities you haven't even imagined yet. Sometimes the key to your future comes in unexpected ways, from sources you never knew existed. If you're someone who has the power to welcome others, to mentor young people, to create opportunities for those who need second chances, I hope this story inspires you to use that power. You might be someone's grandmother, someone's Jeremy, someone's community that makes all the difference between despair and hope. The farm continues to grow and change, but its heart remains the same. A place where young people discover that they matter, that they belong, that they have gifts to offer the world. It's a place where the past and future meet, where legacy and innovation work together to create something beautiful and lasting. As I turn off the lights and head upstairs to the room where my mother once dreamed her own dreams, I'm already planning tomorrow. There's a new group of participants arriving next week, each carrying their own story of challenge and resilience. There are crops to plant and programs to develop, partnerships to build and futures to nurture. But tonight, I'm simply thankful for the key that unlocked everything, for the grandmother who believed in love across time and distance, for the community that taught me what home really means. I'm thankful for the young people who've trusted us with their stories and shown me that the most meaningful legacy you can leave is the knowledge that you've helped others discover their own potential. The barn key may have unlocked a door, but what I found inside was so much more than vintage trucks and family photographs. I found purpose, community, belonging, and the understanding that the best way to honor the gifts you've received is to share them with others who need them. That's the real treasure my grandmother left me. Not just a place to belong, but a way to help others find their own sense of belonging. Not just a family history to claim, but a family legacy to continue. Not just a home to inherit, but a home to share with others who need one. And that legacy continues every day with every young person who discovers they're capable of more than they ever imagined, with every community member who chooses to invest in someone else's future, with every person who decides that belonging isn't something you're born with, but something you create through love, work, and commitment to each other's growth. If you've been touched by this story, I'd love to hear from you in the comments. Tell me where you are watching from, share your own stories of unexpected gifts or communities that welcomed you when you needed it most. Subscribe to hear more stories of resilience and hope, and share this with someone who might need to be reminded that their story isn't over, that there are people ready to believe in their potential even when they can't see it themselves. Because that's what family really is. People who see your potential before you do, who believe in your future even when your past has been difficult, who welcome you home even when you've never been there before. That's the gift my grandmother left me, and it's the gift we try to pass on to everyone who finds their way to this place where belonging is always possible.